Signal to sit down, stop talking. Morning. So we're going back to jumping all over Exodus today. So again, the particular Bible readings that we're looking at should be up on the screen. Obviously, if you have a Bible with you and like looking at them in there, feel free to do that as well. But because we're jumping around all over, I thought it would be easier to have particular bits up. A bit different today because we're going to focus on sort of three sections jumping through rather than looking so closely at a particular part of the text. And the title I've given today is Resources for the Journey. I said yesterday one of the main things that we're grappling with as churches and as clergy in particular at the moment is this experience that I think we all share in common of moving from a time, maybe not a time of settled stability, but a time that in our imagination is a time of settled stability, into a time of uncertainty. So the Exodus imagery of moving into a time of wandering in the wilderness, called to head towards the promised land but not there yet, seems to speak particularly deeply into our calling to lead the church in this time of journeying and wandering. And we spoke yesterday, I know not everyone was able to be here yesterday. We spoke yesterday about the huge contrast in Exodus between the settled stability at the beginning of the book of the Israelites literally building supply cities, infrastructure, and then their near constant movement by the end, pitching camp for a few days or a few weeks, and then breaking up camp and moving on, following the God who moves ever on before them in the essentially ephemeral forms of fire and cloud. Even if our history is considerably more complex than we often allow for, certainly the mythology of the church in the popular imagination is that in the past everyone knew what the church was and what it stood for. It's no longer possible for us to stay in that place where our identity as the Christian church is to build the infrastructure of society. Over the last few decades, certainly over the time I would say that any of us have been in ministry, it's become increasingly obvious that we're moved away from that. We're on the move and we're not sure where we're going to end up. Now, of course, we trust in God's promise that this journeying is not in vain. If we didn't, we wouldn't be on the journey at all. Why would any of us be doing this if we didn't think that we've been called by God to do it? It's an act of faith, being willing to journey with God into the unknown. But that doesn't stop it being hard. Making the mental shift from being part of the infrastructure to being on a journey. And as clergy and ministers in particular, we have to handle not only our own emotions and spiritual response to this new long-term state of uncertainty, but we also have the really difficult task of providing pastoral care and spiritual leadership for our church communities, which are themselves struggling, not just as individuals, but corporately as bodies, with this really fundamental mental shift. So this morning we're going to focus on some of the resources which God provides to sustain and equip the people of God on the journey, and particularly on the resources which God provides to those of us who are charged with sharing in the spiritual leadership of an often fractious and rebellious people in this time of journeying in the wilderness. So we'll have the first of the next slides. There we are. Exodus is primarily associated, I think in most people's minds, with wilderness, with desert. Hence that first picture slide I have, with emptiness. The setup in Egypt, as we looked at yesterday, is a scarcity mindset, where resources are limited and therefore different social and ethnic groups are viewed in terms of competition. The concern of the Pharaoh is to build supply cities, to conserve, manage and distribute resources in a way that is under human control. One of the things that is really striking about the book of Exodus is that the people of God walk away from all of that and find themselves entirely reliant on God as they wander in the wilderness in a way that's desperately uncomfortable for them. And yet, as they do that, we move from a scarcity mindset to them coming to terms with what we might call an abundance mindset. It's a book that's full of the abundance of God's provision. Perhaps the most obvious are the physical resources. When you start looking for them, it's a book absolutely overflowing with stuff that God provides. Water from the side of the rock in chapter 17, quail and manna in chapter 16, we'll look a bit more at that. Jewellery and clothing. Their Egyptian neighbours give the people of God for the asking when they're about to leave, because God had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. In chapter 12, they say to their neighbours, "Can we have some jewellery, please?" And they go, "Yeah, sure, we like you. Here's some jewellery." We're also told in chapter 12 that they took with them livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds. It becomes a little bit odd to wonder why they were moaning so much about not having any food and needed the manna if they had all these great flocks and herds with them, but, you know. And when it comes, as we looked at briefly yesterday, to the building of the tabernacle in chapter 35, we discover they have all sorts of other resources with them. Their luggage is packed. They've got gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple and crimson yarns and fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, fine leather, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, stones and gems. They've not exactly been travelling light. They clearly feel, at various points in their journey, complete panic about how under-resourced they are. And yet when they identify a need, there they've got in their bags whatever they need to fill it. It does seem to me that there is quite a lot to be said there about how our congregations often respond to need. Very often, the panic is completely unnecessary. We tend, as human beings, to panic unless we have more than we need. And yet the resources are very, very often there. And then there are the human resources that they also have at their disposal. They were, in chapter 12 it says there were 600,000 people that left Egypt. That's a lot of people and diversity and skills. And all through the book we hear of a variety of specialist skills that God has equipped the people with. Right in chapter 1, that whole story of liberation is kicked off by the professional skill and the ethical code of the Hebrew midwives and their bravery in standing up to Pharaoh's genocidal command. In chapter 2, we've got Moses' older sister Miriam. As I said yesterday, she demonstrates these incredible skills of watching and waiting and knowing when to intervene to close a deal. Later in the narrative, she emerges as a key named prophet and worship leader in that explosion of joy when they successfully cross the Red Sea, and she leads the women with tambourines and dancing in a song of rejoicing. So we've got worship leaders, we've got midwives. As we saw yesterday in the building of the tabernacle, it's marked with an explosion of joy in creating. There's a real delight, not just in the materials I talked briefly about yesterday, but in the skill of craftspeople and designers. Some of them are named in the text, which is incredibly unusual. Chapter 31, the Lord spoke to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, and I've filled him with divine spirit, with ability, intelligence, and knowledge in every kind of craft, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, and in every kind of craft. Moreover, I have appointed with him Oholiab, and I have given skill to all the skillful." That's a wonderful thing to preach on. We talked a bit yesterday about the joy of crafting. You preach on, "I have given skill to all the skillful." That sense of the resourcing that God gives us in the skills that people have, the wonderful variety of skills that people have in our churches and in our congregations. Nobody has all the skills needed. It's one of the things we're in danger of making the mistake of thinking we ought to have as clergy, isn't it? The most obvious example, of course, is Moses hesitating before God at the burning bush. I always find that quite amusing. Moses sitting there, God has just appeared to him in the burning bush. It's like the prime theophany in the entire Bible. And he sits there going, "Oh, I'm not that good at public speaking, God, really." Absolutely panics. And God, with a certain amount of exasperation, as I read in the text, points out, look, Aaron's good at public speaking, deal with it. Go and get the people you need and do the job that I've given you to do. As a body, they have everything they need. And I've also put governance down here, which again I'll come back to as one of the things I focus on in a bit. There is a really important thread running through the book of Exodus of the practical, pragmatic skills and practices that are needed for a people to work well together in testing and uncertain times. And that these too are an element of God's gracious provision. We might be reminded of the way that gifts of administration are listed alongside the more sort of obviously spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians. I don't know about you, but I quite often find that things like governance, it's quite fashionable in the church to despise them. Quite often when I'm talking with, particularly with curates or with ordinands, I'll quite often find that people go, I was ordained for spiritual things. I was ordained to plant new congregations. I'm ordained to be a pioneer and lead God's people and preach. I'm not interested in all that red tape, all that bureaucracy. I'm not for that. If only we could clear away all the annoying rules and regulations that we have and just get on with doing the work that God calls us to do. Well, I will suggest, and we'll look a bit more at this later, that one of the things that I think is really strong throughout the whole Pentateuch, actually, and particularly in Exodus, is a really practical, it's a strength of Jewish Torah tradition. It's a strength of Jewish theology generally, that there's not a separation between the holy and the pragmatic. They're much more integrated in a way that I think our Christian tradition over the last few hundred years has tended to separate them. And there's a really strong emphasis here on actually, when you're trying to get a group of people to work together, there are practical things that you need to do to make that happen. And these are also gifts of God. And then, of course, there are the spiritual resources, which Exodus is absolutely bursting with. Most of these are not just foundational to that particular journey, to this particular book. They're foundational for the whole Bible, for understanding the whole of the rest of the Bible, and foundational for our Christian understanding of what it is to live a life in relationship with God. If you're going to do a complete, big, sweet, big picture of the Bible, of the biblical narratives, the book of Genesis kind of sets the scene, describes the territory. Exodus sets out the direction of travel and the kind of rules of the road, what's going to keep people safe as they go on this journey together. There are repeated theophanies, appearances of and encounters with God, which punctuate the narrative and keep people going. Always reminds me of the bit in the story of the Magi in Christmas, where I think because of Christmas cards and Christian art, people assume, when you talk to people who only come to church at Christmas, they often assume that the star was there the whole time, don't they? That the Magi's journey was kind of going, okay, star there, walking in that direction. Of course, that's not what the narrative says. The narrative has the star appearing and then going, oh my goodness, something's amazing happened, let's set out in roughly that direction. And then they don't see the star again, which is why they end up in Herod's palace. They end up in completely the wrong place. And it's only after they've left Herod's palace, having kind of got some correction from the locals, that they see the star again and there's great rejoicing. And that, to me, is such a powerful image of what the Christian life is like. I think one of the things that people very often struggle with when they first become Christians is they expect that incredible spiritual high of conversion to be their normal Christian experience. And actually talking to people early about the fact that, you're going to get these little moments, these incredible theophanies, these tiny little moments and glimpses of a star, which are going to keep you roughly on the right track. But we're kind of left to our own resources, i.e. the church. That doesn't just mean left to me and what I think. We're left to our own resources as the people of God to help keep ourselves together between those little moments. But Exodus sets up for the rest of the Bible the expectation that God can reveal God's self to us at any moment, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. that immense intimacy of the encounter at the burning bush, which I'll talk more about in a moment, with the revelation of God, not as another named God among many, not as another tribal God, but as being itself, in that almost untranslatable use of the verb to be, which we typically translate as I am who I am, but I gather it could just as easily be I will be who I will be, or, I am, or however, who knows? It's not really translatable. And which, historically, over the last 100 or 200 years, we've tended to kind of semi-transliterate as Yahweh, but I feel really uncomfortable about that. I prefer you not to do that, because it gives God a name, effectively. It treats it as if it's a proper noun like any other, whereas the entire point of that revelation is that this is God refusing to give himself a name and to say, I'm not like Baal and all the other gods. I haven't got a name. I am who I am. I am being itself. And in fact, if I can allow myself a little feminist excursion, one of the things that I'll quite often point out to people when people say, oh, well, God is male, isn't he? Is, well, actually, it looks a lot more like that because of the translation convention we have, that in our Bibles, the YHWH is very often, there's a translation convention in most biblical translations that is written as Lord in capital letters. That then sounds like a male title for God, which of course it isn't. It's being. So one of my little personal feminist rebellions is quite often when I'm reading the Old Testament to always read that Lord, if it's in capital letters, as being, or I am. And it in some places, it can completely transform, particularly women's understanding of the text. So I do commend that to you. If you're clenching and thinking you can't imagine anything worse, fine, ignore that suggestion. Those of you who aren't, enjoy it. Fill your boots. We've got the encounters on the Holy Mountain, and the giving of the Ten Commandments, the establishment of the covenant, the establishment of the sacred space of the tabernacle and tent of meeting, the establishment of sacred space per se, and the continual presence of God. Exodus sets up the expectation that God will provide the people of God with all that we need, in terms of physical, human, and spiritual resources. The danger with saying that, of course, is it sounds like some kind of mad prosperity gospel. Exodus is really realistic about the struggles, dangers, and temptations of following God in the wilderness. The people are hungry, they're thirsty, they're nostalgic. And actually, I would suggest that the nostalgic is more dangerous than the other two combined. By chapter 32, they've become so dependent on Moses' leadership. We all know the dangers of people becoming dependent on one charismatic leader, don't we? They've become so dependent on Moses' leadership and so thirsty for the certainty of a God they can keep in their control. Moses has gone up onto the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. He's been gone for a bit long. They're panicking. They want something that's there under their control. That they make the golden calf and run wild and suffer hugely as a result. We could easily spend the rest of the conference looking in detail at each one of these. But what I'm going to do this morning, I haven't actually, because I haven't got the iPad, I haven't got any sort of timer. Let me turn my watch off quickly, otherwise I could just go on forever. There we are. Get a sense of time. I'm going to focus particularly on 3 key episodes for the rest of our time this morning. The story of the burning bush in Exodus 13, the story of the manna in Exodus 16, and this lovely little episode with Moses and his father-in-law in Exodus 18. So we've got Exodus 3, 1-4 up here. Oh, there we are. That's okay. We'll have that one. It's got a better picture. If I had to choose just one story from the whole Old Testament, it would probably be the episode of God appearing to Moses in the burning bush. I hope I would never have to choose, but if I did. Note that this happens after Moses has had a very shaky start in life. Obviously, he's had his miraculous origin story. He's had a very privileged upbringing as the princess's adopted son. But he's clearly really struggled in coming to terms with the dual identity that he has as an adopted child. This strange dual identity straddling both privilege and oppression. In Exodus 2, we've seen him kill an Egyptian who he saw beating one of the Hebrew slaves, flexing his new kind of just coming out of adolescent manhood sense of power and beginning to identify with his people. And then the next day, he intervenes in a fight between two of the Israelites, and they jeer at him. Are you going to wield your power here too? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? At that point, he realizes that his action has got around, it's not a secret, and he runs away. And by the time we reach Exodus 3, he's settled in Midian, where he's met and married Zipporah, who herself, I haven't got time to talk about Zipporah, but she's a fascinating character. The first woman to do a religious ritual, and no commentator has any idea what this ritual was about. It's one of those things in the Bible that has just remained completely obscure. But the Midianites are quite interesting, just as a little bit of background to this, because I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this, but in the book of Exodus, one of the big themes that I mentioned yesterday is the establishment of a sense of identity, the identity of we are the people of God, not like those Egyptians. But one of the strands that complexifies that and helps stop it being simply about goodies and baddies, who's on the right side, are the Midianites, who all through the book are people who are not the people of God, and yet are not the enemy either. They are well-disposed, neutral people, a kind of third party, a third group within the text, which helps us to not read it as simply, are you on our side or are you against us? There's always, throughout, this little theme of the Midianites who at no point become followers of God, who are not the people of God, and yet are well-disposed allies. And that's a really important theme, actually, throughout the whole Old Testament, going alongside and helping to counteract some of what could be a narrative that would really play into some of our very unhelpful power dynamics. So he's married Zipporah, he's living with his father-in-law and his daughters, and Egypt must have seemed a very long time ago and a very long way away when he led the flock into the wilderness. The far side of the wilderness, in fact. And that is a really interesting phrase. The wilderness, not just in our own cultural imagination, but in the ancient world, the wilderness really functioned not simply as a description of geographical space. It wasn't just, oh, that desert over there. The phrase the wilderness functioned as the last frontier. So beyond the wilderness, the far side of the wilderness, isn't simply a geographical description. It's a place, a cultural, imaginative space, which is really far outside of anyone's comfort zone, beyond all familiarity. The phrase probably meant something like to infinity and beyond in our culture. It's that kind of code word. And notice that it's here, on the far side of the wilderness, that Moses and we in the narrative first encounter Horeb, the mountain of God, which goes on to have such an important role as a place of encounter with God. And there's something here that's really significant throughout the Bible, which is about God's presence turning space into place by adding corporate memory and meaning. Empty wilderness, even the nameless space beyond the wilderness, on the far side of the wilderness, changes from being outer space, void of social and cultural meaning, to place, as a result of God's presence being encountered there. And you can see that over and over again, particularly in the Old Testament, where episodes close with the formula, so he or so they called that place X, because it was there that Y happened. think of Jacob's ladder, and so there's lots of little piles of stones and wells and all sorts of things scattered throughout the Old Testament geography, where they have got a name because of an encounter with God that happened there. And it seems to me that particularly there's something about our Anglican tradition which is particularly related to place, isn't there? And I think there is something quite interesting for us here about the way that the relationship with place is not simply because it's the geography. It's because it's geography in which an encounter with God has happened. I think that can be quite an interesting way of opening up a conversation with congregations when churches need to close, or we need to move on from them, or we're thinking about establishing somewhere new. Is it just about the building and the memories it holds? Is it about an encounter with God that's happened there? And how can we honour place through name, often, through naming places, which honours the memories and the corporate identity that we want to establish through them? I think there is something quite important about our Anglican identity in that, and this could be an interesting way of entering into that. Now, normally when we focus on this story, we focus on the revelation of God's identity, talked a little bit about that, and on the calling of Moses. But I want to specifically talk this morning, invite you this morning to ponder for a moment on the burning bush. On the bush that is on fire but is not burnt up. Forest fires, obviously, are startling and terrifying sights, perhaps majestic sights if you're viewing them from a safe distance. Very, very destructive. But it's not the destructive power or the kind of tourism nature of it that makes Moses turn aside from the path he's taking with his flocks. He's on his normal everyday round. Well, he's gone beyond his normal everyday round, he's gone beyond the wilderness, but he's doing his normal job. He's taking his flocks to try and find where there is something for them to eat. And what he sees that startles and intrigues him enough to step aside from the day job and to go, he doesn't know he's going to encounter God, but he's intrigued enough to step aside into a place which will become, unbeknownst to him at this point, a place of encounter. Isn't that the bush is on fire. It's that the bush is not consumed by the flames. And it seems to me that one key aspect of our calling as clergy in this wilderness space, this space beyond the wilderness that we're currently inhabiting as a church, is to be like that burning bush for other people. To be intriguing and weird enough that people are drawn to turn aside from their really busy, frantic lives to see what's going on. Not because seeing us is going to somehow instantly convert them, but because in having drawn them aside from, for a moment, all that is busyness and that they're thinking about, that could then become a place of encounter with God. We need to draw the gaze of people who are wandering about, preoccupied with whatever their equivalent of tending the flock might be. And being a light with the fire of God's love, being a light with the love of God, being on fire with God's love and presence is part of that. But it's not enough. Because Vicente talked a bit about this yesterday, this high calling that we have to be on fire for God, to be aflame with God, all too often leads to burnout. We know that, as we feel that the weight of trying to keep the church going, of trying to ensure its survival in a world where we've got less and less money, people, resources, and so on. It's all too easy for us to feel that it's on our watch that the church is going to survive or fail, that we mustn't let God down. And I really often, particularly now I'm Archdeacon, find myself talking with overstretched clergy on the verge of burnout, trying to persuade them to take time off, only for them to insist that they can't, because if they don't do it, it won't get done, and they don't want to be responsible for their church failing, closing, losing its priest. the more I contemplate this passage from Exodus, the more I'm drawn to the fact that what attracts Moses off the beaten track into his encounter with God isn't that the bush is on fire, it's that it's on fire without being burnt up, without being burnt out. It seems to me that in our society, being on fire for a cause and being burnt out by it is frankly nothing special. We, quite often as clergy, exalt ourselves into thinking that this is really special. Actually, it's not. It's certainly nothing attractive. All sorts of jobs and vocations nowadays demand inhumane levels of commitments. There's the traditional caring professions. But I don't know what your labour market is like here, but in England, and certainly I gather from Twitter in the US, one of the things that's making our young people struggle most is that the really dead-end minimum wage jobs are often demanding that they're on 0-hour contracts, they have to be constantly available, but they might not get any work, but they can't do anything else. People being passionate about something, that's not even allowing for the fact that people are passionate about things like climate change, about social justice, and are being burnt out by their passion for that all the time. We've got a massive, I don't know what it's like here, but we've got a massive mental health crisis among young people who are seeing a real perfect storm of, the world's burning out around them, and what are we going to do about it? What's happening with our politics? Are they ever going to be able to afford a house? Are they ever going to get a job? They're certainly not going to have a job for life. The pressure and the stress is huge. They are, young people are always passionate about things. And they're increasingly being burnt out before they've even started. Being on fire, even for God, and being burnt out by it is nothing special. It's not distinctive to clergy, and it's not attractive. What's strange enough to make someone turn aside from the daily grind and want to step out to see what's going on is if we can be on fire without burning out. That's weird. That is really unique. Exodus is a story of journey, not accomplishment. And that is hugely countercultural. It invites us to learn the tough lessons of the wilderness, of learning to be content not with stability and settlement and success, but to be content to be journeying with God, not worrying about where and when we will arrive. It seems to me that that is what might make some harried person take a second look and think, stop and go over and see what's going on there. How can that person be so passionate about what they're doing and yet be so relaxed, be so chill, not be burnt out? How can they love God and yet be taking time off and enjoying their family? Something weird going on there. And we will get people like Pharaoh telling us that we're lazy. We'll tell ourselves it. But that's what will be weird enough to get people to step out. And there's an obvious link here, of course, with the giving of the Sabbath as that gift that comes back in Exodus 34 and 35 as a rhythm for our lives, which includes rest as well as work on a regular weekly basis, like a heartbeat. The second episode I want to invite us to contemplate this morning is the giving of the manna in the wilderness in Exodus 16. We'll have the next slide. This is probably the most obvious example of God's providential resourcing in the whole Bible. It's echoed and recapitulated in those stories of Jesus feeding the many thousands, particularly in John 6, where various versions of the feeding of the thousands aren't there. But in John 6, people follow Jesus afterwards going, you fed us, tell us some more. And the link with this episode of manna is explicitly made in the discussion after that episode. It's a hugely well-known story, which helps when you're talking to people about it. And there are some really obvious points to be made about God's provision for each day being just enough. And learning to be content with and trust in what God will provide. And to resist that natural human temptation to store things up just to be on the safe side. I did originally have a section on it, but I took it out to fit into an hour. But there's a detail in this story, I'm sure you'll know this and remember it, but just in case, where the people are told to go and collect the manna, and they are told to collect just enough for their family. And however much people collected, it was just enough for their family, and they're told not to store it up. And the people who ignored the instruction to not store it up found that the next morning it was full of maggots. It's a really disgusting description. It's got all slimy and it's full of maggots and things. It's horrible. You can't store it. You have to just eat it for today. Deliberately echoed in that phrase in the Lord's Prayer, give us our daily bread. Enough for today. And then when it comes to the Sabbath, they're told to collect enough for 2 days. And of course they're all going, that's disgusting. It'll all turn to slime by the second day. And Moses basically says, trust me. And they go and collect twice as much the day before the Sabbath. And it doesn't disintegrate into slime and maggots for the Sabbath day. So there is enough for that. If one of the things that you're struggling with in your churches giving is always something we're always struggling with in our churches, isn't it? But often it's not so much giving, it's spending. I have a lot of churches where the treasurer won't let the people spend the money. You know, there's £200,000 in the bank or something, but they're saving it for a rainy day, and even when COVID happened, that apparently didn't count. You know, because we have a very natural human tendency to store things up and to only feel safe if we have a big store. And, you know, the numbers will change rapidly, you know, whether that's enough for tomorrow or whether it's enough for 10 years or whether we're hoping that actually what we've got is a trust fund that will pay in perpetuity for a couple of clergy. You know, that the scale will be wildly different in different people's contexts. But there's a really fundamental, deep human desire. Part, I suspect, of what we might call under that cluster original sin of things that are in our psyche, which the gospel challenges us about. To want to have things stored up. And the story of manna really challenges us to live day to day, which is really difficult if you're a registered charity. And when you're trying to deal with people's deep fear about whether their church will be there for their funeral, for their granddaughter's wedding, and want to try and make sure that they can be sure it is by saving things up, risking what's going on today. This is a great story to talk about with people for that. But I want to focus this morning on another particular leadership challenge that Moses faces in this, and this story resourcing as we lead in this space. Because the thing that really stands out for me in Exodus 16 is the fact that this whole episode of the manna comes about in the context of a whole lot of discontented grumbling. This is the 15th day of the second month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. If only we died in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. You've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Remember back in Exodus 12, we're told that they've got countless flocks and herds with them. So it's not quite adding up. But they are moaning. 6 weeks, 15th day of the second month. This is 6 weeks later. And already they are slipping into a really toxic nostalgia. They're sliding over the slavery, the genocide, the whips, the being forced to make bricks without straw. All of that is forgotten. All they're choosing to remember is that they had plenty of food there, pots of meat. And there is something quite deeply psychological about what we do with our memories. We remember good bits. It's like our childhood holidays are all just lovely sunny days on the beach, you know, and we forget the rain. Well, okay, maybe not everyone, but yeah, we forget the rainy days. Everyone thinks that summers were better as children. Everyone thinks that the world was better when they were younger, generally. I used to be a medievalist, and it was quite funny. At one point I did a lecture where I traced a 12th century, a 14th century, an 18th century, and a 20th century newspaper article it was a pamphlet, chronicle thing, somebody's letter, and a 20th century newspaper. The 20th century newspaper one was going, the youth of today. We've got all these hooligans and they're rioting, things like the riots we've just had, the far-right riots. It's terrible. This world didn't... Well, in the 12th century, you've got a letter being written home from some bishop saying, I don't know what we're going to do about the youth of today. We need another war, because honestly, they're just rioting in the streets. And you get the same in the 14th century, you get the same in the... people don't change. Everyone thinks that things were better in the past. But this really brings out how quickly that happens and how toxic it can be when what you're choosing to forget is the really serious reason that you left that place in the first place. We'll just skip to the next slide. This is from Numbers 11, which kind of recapitulates the same episode in Numbers 11, slightly later in the Numbers version. I always find this really funny. They began to crave other food, and they started wailing and saying, if only we had meat to eat. Remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. We could just pick it out of the Nile. The cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. I just find that list of food really funny. We used to have cucumbers. But you put these two passages together, there's a really serious warning about the dangers of nostalgia on the one hand and the craving for novelty on the other. Even here, after the miraculous gift of manna, I'm not quite sure how long they've had manna for this point, God is giving them all that they need. God is giving them manna, giving them blooming quail, for goodness sake. The camp's covered in quail. And they're moaning quite quickly that it's boring. Just if we go to the next slide, it's back to Exodus. That's it. I think one of the hardest things that we have to deal with as clergy, particularly navigating in this space, is grumbling and complaining. It's really soul-sapping to spend your days, on the one hand, dealing with the things of God, trying to do your part in building God's kingdom here on earth, studying the scriptures, offering the sacraments. Like Moses, trying to lead people into a promised land. And on the other hand, have your time and energy drained by people demanding that you listen to their grumbles and complaints, whether about you, or about the church in general, or about one another. And it can really destroy churches when it gets too bad. I'm sure you all know examples of that. And because we tend to be people who are primed to be self-reflective, we're primed and we're trained to be self-reflective and to examine our hearts for sin, we can all too easily find ourselves caught up with and often overwhelmed by a nagging feeling that there must be something wrong with our ministry or something really fundamentally wrong with the church if what we're dealing with is this grumbling. And so I find these stories incredibly helpful in reminding us in the midst of it all that this is nothing new. Now, obviously, in any one complaint that we hear, it might be that I or someone else has genuinely done something wrong, and that they always need proper investigation and examination and self-examination. But these stories, Exodus 16 and Numbers 11, help ground us in the reality that when we're leading a group of people from something that was in the past to something new, grumbling and complaints are inevitable. And they warn us and can help us to teach others about those two twin dangers of craving a nostalgic vision of the past on the one hand, or craving the dopamine of the new on the other. These aren't just stories about God's miraculous provision in the past, or even how we might expect God to provide in the present. Part of God's resourcing us for our task of leading the church is the gift of these key biblical stories themselves. These kind of stories ground us, gift us with grounded biblical examples to use in helping our congregations recognise where their own memories of the glory days when the church was full might be partial, might be holding them back from stepping into the future that God's inviting them into, or helping our congregations recognise the opposite danger of coming to despise the familiar gifts of God because they've become routine, craving new spiritual experiences that, if we're honest with ourselves, are more about our desire for novelty than our desire for God. Just the other week, I was preaching at a church back in Liverpool that's taken the brave but sad decision to close. There were about 12 of them left. They had a big Victorian building. They couldn't look after it. They tried everything. No one was going. It's really hard to close a church in England. It takes at least 3 years. You have to go through all sorts of rounds of consultation, and you have to get the church commissioner's permission. So there's a really difficult point where a church has come to the point where they go, we've got to the end of the road, we need to close. And then they realise that they can't close. They've actually got to keep things going for another few years in what's a really weird wilderness space of knowing they want to close, but they're not there yet. Anyway, we finally got the permissions through from the church commissioners. We set a date. And I went to see them and I said, well done, we've got there, and we're going to close on the 6th of October, and I'm going to come and do a final service. And they all went, what? That's a bit soon. We all feel abandoned. Why does the church not care about us? And I was like, you do remember that you actually made the decision that you wanted to close? And I preached for them on this passage, which I hadn't particularly intended to do, because they needed to remember why they'd made that decision, and that they had chosen to walk away. Obviously, we wanted to celebrate the good times of the past, but they had chosen to walk away for really good reasons. But in those few weeks, they'd forgotten all of that and had started complaining. So part of the resourcing that God gives us, a key part, I think, isn't necessary to rain down. We're not expecting manna and quail to appear in our camps. We're not expecting the money, the people, the new church roof we could all do with. It would be lovely, but we know that is not our normal experience. But we have been equipped with this incredibly rich store of stories to feed us and sustain us on our journey. The third episode we're going to focus on this morning is from Exodus 18. It's not such a well-known story, so I've actually put the whole thing up on 3 slides. So let me just give you a moment to read this one, and then we'll skip to the next one, and then the third. So Exodus 18. Moses, when they'd got to the point of going to Pharaoh and all the plagues and all that big dramatic bit, which I've completely skipped over, Moses had sent his wife Zipporah and their 2 children back to Midian for safekeeping, because obviously he wasn't quite sure how safe this journey was going to be. But now they've crossed the Red Sea, they've defeated the Amalekites with that beautiful passage where Moses can't hold his hands up on his own but has to have them held up by others. Jethro hears that they've got there, and he decides that time has come. Maybe the children were getting annoying, I don't know, but he decides the time has come to bring them back to Moses. And do you have a kind of bring your daughter to work day thing? There was a thing that was a thing. I don't know, come back again pre-COVID, since COVID, but for a few years in England, particularly in industry where there was concern about not enough women being involved in industry, there was a day called Bring Your Daughter to Work Day, where people were encouraged to take their daughter to work, to open girls' eyes to different careers. This is a bit of a bring your father-in-law to work day. So Jethro has come and he watches Moses at work, and he effectively offers wise coaching advice. He goes and he's quite impressed, and Moses, I think, is a little bit proud. I think he's a bit like, look, father-in-law, I've made something of myself here. All the people are coming to me on my throne, and I'm making wise decisions. Look how important I am. And Jethro stands there patiently all day, and he watches this huge crowd of people around Moses. And at the end he goes, what you're doing is not good. And bless him, Moses takes it and takes the advice and is willing to listen. What Jethro points out is that this isn't just about Moses wearing himself out. This isn't just, you can't deal with this is going to wear yourself out, this is going to burn you out, you need to be more careful. What Moses is doing is wasting everyone's time. And I suspect that maybe a little bit of Moses' shadow side was getting quite a lot of affirmation from the fact that hundreds of people were standing around waiting on his word. But that meant that hundreds of people were waiting all day, hoping to get their chance in the queue to speak to Moses. The people are standing around from morning till evening, it says. The process that Moses has established, probably not deliberately, it's a process that has emerged through this strange wilderness time, where everything has to go through him, is hugely inefficient. It's wearing him out, and it's wasting a huge amount of everyone's time and energy. And I suspect what's happened is that, having been the heroic leader of Exodus 4 to 17, which was what was needed at the time, Moses has got used to being the one who needs to be there. And the people want him there. There's an echo, isn't there, of later on where the people are going, give us a king, we want a king. This is a model of leadership that we are comfortable with. We quite like being dependent. We like there being someone there whose job it is, so we don't have to worry about it. Jethro gently helps him to see that now that they're in a new phase, the initial urgent crisis has gone. They've got over the Red Sea. They've got manna. There is no major resource crisis at the moment. Now they're in this new phase of life. Alternative arrangements could be made which would be more sustainable for everyone. Not only will Moses be able to stand the strain, but also all these people will go home satisfied. And I think that's really important when it comes to us talking about our self-care and our boundaries and so on, because quite often it can feel quite selfish and self-indulgent. And one of the barriers we have to putting in place arrangements that will spread the load a bit is that we feel that really maybe we should be doing things, and if it's that we're not coping, then maybe that's just that we need to be a bit better at coping. It's a really important point that Jethro points out here to Moses, that this is a barrier to everyone else. I used to be incredibly disorganised. My husband might laugh because he might think I'm still incredibly disorganised. But I used to be incredibly disorganised, and I used to slightly pride myself on it, if I'm honest. You know, I had a little bit of that, well, Einstein says if a tidy desk is a sign of a tidy mind, you know, what is an empty desk a sign of? You know, pictures of Einstein's desk, and like, look how creative I am, look how, you know. And then I realised in my second parish just how frustrating that was for everyone. And it was one brave person in my parish who actually told me. They were really, really pissed off with me. But most people up till then had been going, oh, we're going to have to ask Miranda what the readings are, what the hymns are, what the plan is for today. And, you know, when she has the time, because she's very busy, obviously, when she has time, we'll ask her. And they were getting really, really frustrated, but they weren't saying anything because they assumed that was how it was meant to be. And one brave person blew up at me and was like, this is not okay. You know, we're all busy people, we've got time, you need to be more organised, you need to have this up on a rota somewhere that we can all see it so that we can actually plan things around our lives, because frankly, you're not the only show in the road. They didn't quite put it like that. That's how I heard it. And after sobbing for a couple of days, hiding under the duvet and feeling, you know, nearly resigning and deciding maybe that would be an overdramatic response, I kind of went, actually, I've got to step up and I've got to get things a bit more organised, not because that would be better for me, but because that would be better for everyone else. And I came across this passage a few months later, and it really, really spoke to me. That actually our organisation and our governance matters, not just because it will make things easier for us, but because it will make things easier for everyone else. Inefficient governance wastes a huge amount of time and energy. So what Jethro proposes is a new model of ministry which requires new governance arrangements. Instead of a single charismatic leader doing everything, they'll become primarily responsible for teaching other people, giving other people a sense of the vision. It's really interesting. He's teaching them the rules, but they haven't actually been given the rules yet. One of those little time slip things that we quite often get in the Old Testament. And then, having taught them, they can then be trusted to administer at various different local levels. There's a kind of proto-subsidiarity thing going on, tens and fifties and hundreds and thousands. I've come back to this passage recently, having become Archdeacon, which is largely a bureaucratic and administrative role. Bureaucracy and administration does not have a great press at the moment in the English Church. It's really common to hear people moaning about the diocese or the centre. I'm seeing a few nods of recognition. And I've been a priest for 21 years. I've done my fair share of that, and I've had to eat my words in more recent years. I do have an instinctive sympathy for that. Very few of us go into this because of our love for administration. But time and time again, I've seen, and I'm sure you will be able to see your own examples, I've seen how a distaste for, a disregard for, often a kind of quite snobbish disdain for good governance can absolutely destroy a church. At the very least, it means that people end up wasting a lot of time that could be better spent. So it's inefficient. That's the good end of things. At the worst, poor governance can mean that really serious abuses go unnoticed or unchallenged until the day that they explode in everyone's face. And even if having better governance wouldn't have stopped whatever awful thing has gone on, if you've got good governance in place, when that awful thing happens, you have a church that actually is able to function and cope, rather than completely fall apart in recrimination. We've got a case at the moment, it's in the press, so I can mention it, where a clergy person was arrested 18 months ago for online sexual offences. Hasn't come to court yet because we've got a massive court backlog in England. So he's been suspended all this time. Most churches would have completely crumbled. This particular church is not a big church, it's not a wealthy church, but it's got some really, really good people. It's got a really good reader, it's got a couple of church wardens who really know what they're doing, it's had quite a stable leadership, they've got a PCC, and they've just coped. Obviously it's been difficult, obviously it's been, it's been really, really upsetting for people, but the day-to-day life of the church has been able to cope with that incredibly disruptive situation because the PCC secretary knows what they're doing. The minutes have gone out in time. Not everything went through the vicar. There was a slight moment where the parish computer was impounded. In fact, we still haven't got it back, and that had all the baptism bookings on. So no one knew if anyone was being baptised in the coming months. But there were little details like that needed to be sorted out. But actually, good governance is absolutely foundational. It's not fashionable, it's not sexy, but it's really, really important. When we think about the giving of the law in Exodus, we tend to focus on the Ten Commandments, these big dramatic tablets of stone, iconic commandments. And then perhaps if we're really into the detail of law in the Bible, we might go into the rest of chapter 20 and chapters 21, 22, 23 with all those little tiny details fleshing out regulations about how those might be lived out in the particular context of a nomadic society journeying through the wilderness. Rules about the appropriate levels of compensation if your ox gores someone else. If it's the first time, very different from if you've been warned that your ox might gore someone else and had let it get out accidentally. These are practical regulations for how you're going to deal with living together in a particular context. And obviously, we don't tend to argue about ox goring. Maybe you do in Australia, I don't know. But questions about rules and law and governance, which are partly about justice and about making sure that there are rules so that there isn't one law for the rich and one law for the poor. Part of the point of codifying these things is to say, no, that's what's going to happen, whether or not you're the big local landlord or the tiny peasants. It's partly about fairness. But obviously questions about how we should live and interpret by these ancient biblical laws, I probably don't need to say, are a fairly major source of tension in our churches at the moment. What I want to point out here is it's only in the text, if we take the order that the text is given to us seriously, It's only after a robust, sustainable practice of governance has been established that the commandments are given. Law in Exodus doesn't start with the commandments. It's not, here are the 10 commandments, now how are you going to deal with them? It's how are you going to live together as a group of people in a way that's going to be able to cope with having some canons, some laws, some regulations. A good governance system is foundational. With that established, the people of God are in a position to receive and apply God's guidance as to how best to live in their current situation. So please don't despise good governance as somehow unspiritual or unbiblical. I know I've said that. I've only got 7 minutes. Right, okay, too many excursions. Let's go to the next slide. Rites of passage. I haven't got a video for you today, I've got a diagram. One way of reading the book of Exodus, I'll do this bit quickly. How many pages have I got left? Is to see the overarching story as an archetypal rite of passage, with the journey functioning as the central liminal element. This is a very simple version of a French ethnographer from 1909 who wrote a book called Les Rites de Passage, which even if you don't speak French, I'm sure you can translate. And he came up with this model, which has been pretty foundational in sociology ever since. He studied rites of passage in different societies. They loved doing that in the early 20th century. They were very into ethnography across different societies. And he found that these almost always had 3 key elements across very different social contexts. And actually it's fascinating to apply this to things like the way baptism rituals work in your particular context now. But he found they all had these 3 sections, these 3 elements. An element of separation from a social structure. The liminal state, where you're not in either, and an element of reincorporation into a new social structure. I find this incredibly helpful. I found it incredibly helpful over the last few years in dealing with teenagers. You know, all that kind of, I hate you, you're the worst mum in the world, throwing things in your face kind of moments that you get with teenagers are completely natural. They have to do that. They have to separate themselves from the existing social structure where they are behaving as a child to go into the liminal state of teenagerness in order to then be able to reincorporate themselves into adulthood. It's just normal and natural. It helps take it a bit less personally. And I think that can help in our situations in churches. A lot of the time when people are really raging about things, although it comes across as, you're a terrible preacher and you're destroying our church, or whatever, maybe that's just me, it's often actually about people expressing their discomfort at moving from one structure to another. I quite often find that when people are leaving a church, when they've felt that they want to go to a different church, they have to go through a kind of rejecting mummy stage in order to give themselves permission to move to the church they actually want to go to. Anyway. So in Exodus, obviously, the section we looked at the beginning, the separation and the curses and that whole long process of negotiation with Pharaoh is this quite extended state of separation, pulling themselves away from what was a very uncomfortable place to be and yet a state of familiarity that it took a lot to get away from. The liminal stage in the wilderness. And then you can read the sort of final third of Exodus, a lot of the detail of the rules and the regulations, the detail of the tabernacle. Again, there's about 10, 15 chapters, which generally as Christians we kind of go, yeah, blah, 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 blah. But effectively what's going on there is you're seeing the reincorporation into a new social structure of the people of the covenant. And if we look at Exodus like this, then what are often known in the literature as the murmuring stories, the complaints that we looked at when we looked at manna, are part of this liminal stage. And in fact, the Numbers one comes at the beginning of the incorporation stage. In Exodus, they're part of Israel in that adolescent role, testing their relationship with God and Moses. Are you still going to love me if I moan enough? All that kind of stuff. And it's really noticeable that in Exodus, the complaints aren't met with punishments. There's really serious punishment with things like the golden calf later, but the complaints are just kind of, oh, you're moaning, have some quail, have some manna. It's really quite striking. Whereas, after we've had this revelation, this experience at Mount Sinai, the revelation of the recommitment of the covenant, the revelation of the law, and the establishment of the ritual elements, all these kind of sections of reincorporation into a new social structure, it's still not a final social structure. They're still wandering in the wilderness, but they've created the cultic priesthood, they've created the tabernacle, they've created a lot of these elements of a new organisation. After that, which is where the Numbers 11 complaints come in, the murmurings are no longer acceptable. They're now seen as a sign of lack of faith in God or his appointed leadership. So taking it away from that particular detail, I just want to suggest that there are different expectations for the people of God and different strategies appropriate for leadership at different stages of the journey. And I wonder if part of our kind of growing pains at the moment is that we've been used for so long to living in this new incorporation stage, and actually what we're being asked to do is go back to a new experience of separation. We're in a period where we're gradually and painfully separating ourselves from what's been a settled state of Christianity for several centuries, in terms of how it's seen in the world, how it understands itself in the world, and beginning to enter a new liminal stage. And so our expectations of what God might provide and how we might relate to God and what's going to be needed are going to need to adapt. As clergy, inevitably, our role is completely thrown up into the air. Because, let's go to the next slide. Priests in any society, in any time, not just Christian priests, not just Christian clergy, priests in any society have always represented something of the settled order. You know, once you've got religion of some sort, sociologically, it has something to do with the way things are and interpreting the way things are to the people. And in Exodus 28 and 29, we see the establishment of the cultic priesthood. I'm a bit nervous about using the term the cultic priesthood because it sounds like I'm being really critical, but it's just the term that the literature uses. You know, there is a particular organisation, religion in some formal sense, is being established here, with places and clothing and people who are set aside to do it. There's a new priestly caste being established, being dwelt on in loving detail as this new order is established. And I think for many, this is the familiar role of the priest, people who are set apart for God, wearing appropriate holy garments, ministering in and mediating access to sacred spaces. That is all established at the end of the book of Exodus. And in many ways, although it changes quite dramatically in the way that it's mediated and understood, and some of the geography and the architecture changes, actually in many ways it doesn't change very much from then to maybe 50 years ago. That has been a settled state, and for many people, for many of us when we were trained, for many people who are looking back with a certain sense of nostalgia into the past, this is what the church is and is for. Now, don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying I don't think that is what the church is and what it's for, and I think that is a really important element of our roles. However, I just want to suggest that in this current space we're in, as we are moving back in the big story of Exodus to a new stage of separation, actually we need to become much more comfortable with different imagery for our roles, or for holding together. We're people who are quite good at holding together in tension paradoxes, so we should be able to do this, holding together elements of this aspect of our role with other elements. And I want to suggest, if we go right back to the very beginning of Exodus, we'll go to the next slide, that our current role in the space we're in might be more like that of midwives than of this cultic priesthood. I love the imagery of midwifery for what we do as clergy, helping others to bring to birth what God is creating in them and with them. It's not our creation, the baby that we're helping bring out into the world. It's not primarily our work to make it happen, but we stand alongside with a certain amount of technical knowledge, learned community wisdom and skill, ready to support and encourage and intervene when things are going wrong. My middle child had a water birth, and one of the midwives just said, "Can you just turn onto your side?" Turns out he was completely stuck, shoulders and everything, and this could have gone horribly wrong. And she was just like, "Just turn onto your side, just very gently," and it all worked. And that technical skill and knowing when to intervene with a little suggestion from our accumulated knowledge and wisdom and tradition and heritage seems to me to be a skill that is really key to our role at the moment. So I want to end, because it is 2 minutes past 10 now. I was encouraged yesterday to do more excursions off, so I've just done that, which means that we've run out of time. I'm going to end on a poem. This is not like the poems you heard last night, it's the poem that I wrote, so I'm not making any claims for it. But I wrote this on retreat a few years ago, and it came back to me as I was thinking about this, because I think it holds together something of those two final images, so that we don't need to see them as opposed to one another, but as two sides of the same coin, two elements of our vocational identity that can, I hope, be integrated together. So remembering what it was like when my third child was about 18 months old, and I was a college chaplain in quite a formal context and had to attempt to do communion, fully robed in chasuble and everything, whilst also holding a small child. There is no greater awkward joy than to celebrate communion one-handed. Clasping a child in your other arm, feeling its small, warm body conform itself to your curves, feeling yourself move that one side of your body into that universal jig that all flesh doesn't know it knows until a baby is put into its arms. One hand splayed against the soft heaviness of head and neck, the other outstretched in prayer. You make God real in flesh and blood, bread and wine, tangible, fragile, consumable. One small corner of your mind, concerned to do this with all possible dignity to placate those who may feel the baby detracts from the seriousness of the occasion. Another wondering if dry cleaning would remove baby sick from the shoulder of the antique chasuble should need arise. In that moment, you are both the baby and God, feeling all God's fierce and tender protectiveness that these tiny, fragile things are held in your hands, feeling all the infant's fierce and needy grasping to be held, protected, loved, clasping a miniature fistful of chasuble against being dropped, offering a mere handful of bread against being alone. Afterwards, I know I will hear both complaints and sentimentality. But this moment is neither sentimental nor profane. If I had a spare hand, I would take off my shoes. For here God is speaking, I am, into my very body.